Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my top 40 running back rankings for Week 2 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses allowed the most fantasy points to opposing running backs, so that we're informed as to the most advantageous and most disadvantageous matchups going into Week 2. After that, I'll transition into talking about my top 40 running back rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these players' overall rankings. If you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, there are timestamps down in the description, so be sure to check those out while you're down there. Subscribe to the channel if you have not yet already. Click the like button, and be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Again, there's many of offers available there, link down in the description. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay. So let's talk about matchups going into Week 2. Of course, based on the performances of Week 1, we can take this information in some circumstances and use it to our advantage. But until we get more and more data, it is very difficult to determine which matchups really are the greatest going into the remainder of the 2024 season. Now, the Carolina Panthers, they were in this conversation all of last season, so it's no surprise that they continue to be at the top of this conversation thus far in 2024. But as for the Los Angeles Rams, they're expected to be a good run-stopping defense. Now, luckily for the Los Angeles Rams, they're not going to have to take on the Detroit Lions every single week. Now, what I've gone ahead and done in regards to matchups is I've presented running back rushing statistics aloud, because over the course of a season, that is the pure indicator as to whether or not a running back has a great matchup or not, because receiving statistics is based purely on whether or not that team wants to implement their running back within the receiving game on a consistent basis, rather than the matchup itself. Now, in regards to some of the more difficult matchups, of course, the Minnesota Vikings, Tennessee Titans, New Orleans Saints, they didn't allow over 50 rushing yards to opposing running backs. A lot of other defenses didn't as well, but over the course of the season, we'll get more information, and these will balance out to give us a pure indicator as to which matchups we want to take advantage of going to a given week. Now, before we go ahead and transition into talking about my top 40 running back rankings, for those of you guys who want my all-encompassing rankings every single Sunday morning before kickoff for the remainder of the season, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up today using code Andrew, making a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only will you be able to take advantage of the first-time deposit offer, you're going to be able to get my rankings sent from my email directly to yours from weeks 2 through 18. These are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings, includes flex, so that you can set your lineup and lead yourself to success, and of course, capturing a 2024 fantasy football championship. For those of you interested, be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility, and if you're not eligible based on your current location, or if you've used the code in the past or somebody else's code, you can check out the Patreon. All this content and much more available there. All information down in the description. Thank you very much. Okay. So let's talk about my top 40 running back rankings, beginning with our number one, Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams, taking on the Arizona Cardinals, one of the more advantageous matchups, primarily because Kyren Williams has proven in the past that he has dominated against this defense. Even this last week, of course, James Cook had a great game. James Cook would have even had a better game against this run-stopping defense if it wasn't for the fact that, of course, Josh Allen scored 2 rushing touchdowns. But when we look at 2023, Kyren Williams taking on the Arizona Cardinals, he took them on in Week 6 and in Week 12. In Week 6, 21.8 fantasy points. In Week 12, 35.4 fantasy points. When you combine the statistics of those two games, I mean, again, he had 158 rushing yards in one and 143 in the other. He was averaging 8.36 yards per carry in those two games against the Arizona Cardinals in 2023. And with Blake Corum getting literally 0 snaps played in Sunday night's game against the Detroit Lions, and going forward, it being all Kyren Williams, the expectation is an incredible week and him getting back into the top conversation at the running back position. Our number 2 is Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley, what an incredible debut to have with the Philadelphia Eagles. An incredible performance of 109 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, and had a receiving touchdown within the red zone. 32.2 fantasy points, an incredible overall game. And many of us did have concerns this offseason, primarily because we had concerns that perhaps Jalen Hurts would be the red zone threat as he was last season. Jalen Hurts, amongst all players in 2023, had the 7th most red zone rushing attempts. Now, obviously, thus far this season, from Week 1, Saquon Barkley leads all players in red zone rushing attempts, 8 overall. If he's going to continue to get those red zone opportunities going in his direction, considering the brotherly shove/tush push isn't as effective in the absence of Jason Kelce, which we talked about all offseason, Saquon Barkley is going to continue to be of value. Taking on the Atlanta Falcons this week doesn't bother me one bit, primarily because of the elite nature of the Philadelphia Eagles offensive line. Number 3, we have Bijan Robinson. Speaking of the Philadelphia Eagles matchup, look, Bijan Robinson had himself a solid performance. In terms of overall touches, 18 rushing attempts and 5 receptions. I mean, when you're getting 23 opportunities and 23 touches in a singular game, we'll take it every single week. On top of that, over 100 all-purpose yards. And even though he wasn't able to get a touchdown, again, this Atlanta Falcons offense is still trying to find their stride with a new offensive coordinator, with a new quarterback. Ultimately, they had their opportunities, but not too many opportunities down in the red zone in order to get Bijan Robinson touchdown upside. They were 1 for 2 in terms of red zone trips. They were 2 for 9 in terms of third down conversions, and they had 11 less minutes in terms of time of possession against the Pittsburgh Steelers. As long as they can at least improve going into this upcoming week's matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, the expectation is that Bijan Robinson's going to be successful, just needs a touchdown in order to get himself to that next level and maintain this S-tier standing. Number 4, we have Breece Hall. Now, even though that game got out of hand relatively quickly, Breece Hall is the entire offense. 21 total touches continues his share of workload like we saw majority of last season. Again, from weeks 5 through 18 of last year was getting 21 touches per game on average. So if we're going to continue to be in that conversation, was able to also score himself a touchdown. This offense should continue to improve as they gain more experience, and they have a far easier matchup on hand taking on the Tennessee Titans in comparison to the defense of the San Francisco 49ers. When you're taking on a Super Bowl contending team in comparison to a team that may be last place within their own division, the Tennessee Titans this week, it is going to be a far easier overall experience for Breece Hall, who's getting it done on the ground and, of course, through the air, which is the biggest bonus to his overall workload of production for fantasy purposes. Number 5, we have Jonathan Taylor. Even though Jonathan Taylor could very easily be in this S-tier conversation, I have him one spot lower primarily because of the threat of someone like Anthony Richardson stealing rushing touchdowns. Now, Anthony Richardson did score his rushing touchdown on a quarterback scramble within the red zone, so I don't equate that to technically Anthony Richardson stealing a touchdown with a designed run of sorts, but nonetheless, the threat is always looming. In regards to Jonathan Taylor, he played 96% of the offensive snaps, pretty much never came off the field, and no other running back on the Colts actually had a rushing attempt. So going forward, taking on the Green Bay Packers without Jordan Love, this should be a game in which the Indianapolis Colts are dominating. In fact, when we saw, of course, Saquon Barkley put together 109 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns against this defense, my expectation is that the Colts have a great offensive line. It is elite in nature in terms of run blocking ability. So why not Jonathan Taylor having himself the upside of dominating against the Packers defense when the Packers offense is probably going to be 3 and outs and punts for majority of the game with Malik Willis as their starting quarterback. This is going to be a one-sided game, and with the run-heavy approach and a positive game script, it should lead to a lot of fantasy points for Jonathan Taylor. Number 6, we have Joe Mixon. Within the AFC South division, of course, we had the Indianapolis Colts taking on the Houston Texans. And, of course, the Indianapolis Colts could not stack the box. And because of that, they had to go ahead and try to cover Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins, and Tank Dell. And they still weren't able to accomplish that. But in their efforts in doing that, they allowed Joe Mixon to tear apart their defense. Joe Mixon had 33 total touches, 30 on the ground, and 3 through the air. 25.3 fantasy points and a half PPR. Just to put it into perspective, Joe Mixon has been in the National Football League for quite some time, and only 2 other times in his career has he had 33 or more touches in a singular game. But his first game in his tenure with the Houston Texans getting this kind of volume of touches is incredible. Just to put into perspective how efficient he was, of his 30 rushing attempts, 19 of them were 4 or more yards. Of his 30 rushing attempts, 25 of them were 3 or more yards. Incredible production across the board. When you're taking on light boxes for the entire season, it's going to be easy. And taking on the Chicago Bears should be more of the same. Number 7, we have Jordan Mason. For many of you who went ahead and picked him up prior to the game, or of course, heeded my overall warning, with either the waiver wire video or the weekend streams that we went ahead and did over the course of week 1, hopefully you picked up Jordan Mason and you had the insurance policy for Christian McCaffrey. Even though it was unexpected for Christian McCaffrey to miss, obviously, in the efforts of Jordan Mason, it was obvious that they did not need Christian McCaffrey to play in that game. Jordan Mason, last night, 5.25 yards per carry and 3.43 yards after contact per attempt. Both improvements on his 2023 campaign, and in that year was over 5 yards per carry and over 3 yards in terms of yards after contact per attempt. Amongst all running backs in week 1, he was number 2 in terms of missed tackles forced with 9, and he was number 1 in terms of rushes of 10 yards or more with 5 total. Jordan Mason immediately fills into this overall offense, and behind an elite offensive line and in a scheme where Kyle Shanahan is giving him opportunities to find a lot of success. Again, 28 rushing attempts and had himself a reception. Again, the volume is there, and going up against the Minnesota Vikings, we're expecting him to find success. Now, going into this week, if Christian McCaffrey does end up playing, he's an automatic start in a top 3 running back, assuming, of course, there are no setbacks and he's able to get himself a full participation of practice. Now, speaking of Christian McCaffrey, he did end up screwing me over last night. Many of you got screwed over in terms of not having Jordan Mason, but for me, I had a pick 'em slip, a $1,000 entry via Underdog Fantasy in regards to Christian McCaffrey anytime touchdown, along with Garrett Wilson and CJ Stroud. And both Garrett Wilson and CJ Stroud were able to complete their overall, challenges here. But Christian McCaffrey being absent didn't hurt me too much. I still ended up winning 1,000. And by the time we get to Friday's video of hidden gems, I will continue on this streak of putting $1,000 pick 'em slip every week. So for those of you interested to follow, be sure to check that out on Friday's episode of Hidden Gems. Thank you very much. Okay, let's talk about our number 8 running back to begin the next tier. We have Devon Achane. Now, under the assumption that Devon Achane is healthy and ready to go, I know he's dealing with an ankle injury, and it is a short week taking on the Buffalo Bills on Thursday Night Football. We're going to hope that he's ready to go and he's ready to play. Now, in week 1 against the Jacksonville Jaguars, they were down for a majority of the contest, and that could very easily happen once again this week against the Buffalo Bills, considering last season against the Buffalo Bills, they were handled in both those contests. So if, in fact, they're going to be in a negative game script, there's going to be a lot of Devon Achane within the receiving game. Once again, Devon Achane had 7 receptions on 7 targets for 76 receiving yards. Having ran 26 routes in week 1 and getting 7 targets is a 27% target rate, which is a great number. And from what we saw in 2023, in week 4 and 18 against the Buffalo Bills, in those games, 25.5 fantasy points, 12.6. Again, even though it's a short week and he's dealing with a little bit of an injury, if he's good to go and he's fired up, he's in our starting lineup. Number 9, we have the thumbnail of today's episode, Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs is taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Based on Vegas overall implicated total points, this should be the highest scoring game of the week. And the Detroit Lions are pretty big favorites. Jahmyr Gibbs, the last time they took on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers was in the playoffs in 2023. Against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, accumulated 9 rushing attempts for 74 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 4 receptions, 40 receiving yards, and 19.4 fantasy points in a half PPR. Very similar numbers to what he was able to accumulate against the Los Angeles Rams on Sunday Night Football. 40 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 4 receptions, 34 receiving yards, and 15.4 fantasy points. What makes Jahmyr Gibbs an automatic start every single week is considering his receiving workload, of course, 3+ receptions in each of the last 4 games, and the fact that he has scored 15 total touchdowns in the last 15 games that he has played. Again, an automatic start this week. Number 10, we have Isiah Pacheco. Isiah Pacheco's taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals got absolutely torched by Rhamondre Stevenson and the New England Patriots offensive line. And the Bengals haven't won a game in week 1 or week 2 since 2021. The Bengals always start slow. And if their offense is going to start slow once again out of the gates, it's going to allow for the Kansas City Chiefs to come out, take an early commanding lead, and then run the ball for the entirety of that second half. Now, of course, last week, even though Isiah Pacheco was given great opportunity, 17 total touches, it was a difficult matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. When we're talking about Rhamondre Stevenson running for 120 and a touchdown, I'm expecting a lot of upside for Isiah Pacheco, who most recently in 2023 took on the Cincinnati Bengals in week 17. In that game, 26 fantasy points, 18 carries for 130 rushing yards, 7 receptions for 35 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Number 10 may be a little bit low for Isiah Pacheco this week. Number 11, we have Derrick Henry. So many of you guys had asked me over the course of last week after the Thursday Night Football game if I was worried about Derrick Henry, and I continue to say, no, I'm not worried. If this team is in a negative game script in which they are going to lose, they throw the ball a lot more than they run. And when I went ahead and looked at the averages in regards to when Todd Monken has been the offensive coordinator of this team thus far this season and throughout the entirety of the 2023 season, even including the playoffs, in losing efforts, the Baltimore Ravens throw the ball on average 33 times per game and run the ball 16 times per game for their running backs. In winning efforts, they only throw the ball 28 times and have 23 rushing attempts per game for their running backs. That's a huge 7 rushing attempt swing in the direction of the potential of Derrick Henry getting himself a lot of opportunity this week, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders. They are the biggest favorites based on Vegas overall spreads in terms of a 9.5 point favorite going into the given week. The expectation is a lot of opportunity for Derrick Henry, who, yes, had himself 5 rushing attempts in the first drive of that game against the Kansas City Chiefs and was relatively quiet for the remainder of the game. But going into this week, there's going to be a lot of rushing attempts, and once they have a commanding lead, they're only going to continue to bleed the clock with Derrick Henry in the second half. Number 12, we have Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara had himself a great week 1, 5 receptions, 15 rushing attempts. In terms of overall opportunity, he's gotten himself 20 or more total opportunities. That's a total of rushing attempts and targets within a single game. He's been able to accomplish that number in 9 of the last 13 healthy games. That's a 70% success rate. So as long as he's going to continue to get workhorse level of opportunity, taking on the Dallas Cowboys just means that he's going to have more opportunity for more receptions, because the Dallas Cowboys should be able to be a far more difficult defense to take on. The rushing attempts are going to be there for Kamara. He's going to get the red zone opportunities. And quite frankly, he's probably going to get even more checkdowns, as Derek Carr is going to have to get the ball out of his hands as Micah Parsons is trying to run him down. With more receiving work just means more upside for Alvin Kamara. Number 13, we have Kenneth Walker. Now, I only have Kenneth Walker at 13 under the assumption that he's going to be healthy. Obviously, we know that he left the game on Sunday against the Denver Broncos with an abdomen injury. And if, in fact, it's not so serious, like he mentioned at the end of that game, I'm going to be fine. You know, we heard Christian McCaffrey say that he was going to play, and that was a bold-faced lie. So we're going to have to wait and see. If, in fact, by the time we get to Sunday, he is not going to play, Zach Charbonnet will be moved up within the rankings. And, of course, you can join us on Sunday morning as I live stream with updated rankings on screen for those of you interested in seeing where exactly I'm going to have him ranked. Outside of that, if he's going to be healthy, this is going to be a positive game script taking on the New England Patriots defense. The New England Patriots defense wasn't really exploited this last week by the Cincinnati Bengals. They struggled heavily. And because of that, the New England Patriots were able to take advantage of that. But the New England Patriots had more rushing attempts and more rushing yards than they had passing yards and passing attempts. So going into this week, the Seattle Seahawks, who are looking sharp already, Kenneth Walker, 20 carries for 103 yards and a rushing touchdown, should be able to barrel the ball down the defense's throat for majority of this game and quite frankly find themselves a lot of success within the given week. An automatic start in my mind, as long as he's healthy. Number 14, we have David Montgomery. In the 2023 playoff game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 10 rushing attempts for 33 rushing yards, 3 receptions for 14 receiving yards, and 6.2 fantasy points. One of the few games that he hasn't scored a touchdown in recently. Because when we talk about David Montgomery, it's often in relation to him being touchdown dependent because he's not getting much receiving utilization. And of course, he is splitting the backfield in terms of snaps and potential total touches with Jahmyr Gibbs. But luckily for David Montgomery, he has scored a total of 16 touchdowns in the last 17 games he has played. So as long as he continues to have touchdown upside, this is going to be expected to be one of the highest scoring games of the week with the Detroit Lions being the clear favorites. The expectation is a lot of opportunity going in his direction. Even against the Rams last week, had a singular drive in which he had 8 rushing attempts. There was 5 consecutive plays where he had back-to-back-to-back rushing attempts. As long as the team continues to give him opportunity, he is in line for a great volume of fantasy points for sure. Number 15, we have James Conner taking on the Los Angeles Rams, a division rival within the NFC West. When we talk about the back end of the 2023 season and the beginning of the 2024 season, James Conner has had 6 consecutive games of 17 or more touches. But what the biggest surprise was that he was getting himself a lot of utilization within the receiving game. 4 targets, 3 receptions, 33 receiving yards, which is huge for his overall baseline of production. With Trey Benson not really getting much utilization and workload within the offense, we're going to pretty much continue with James Conner being the workhorse back. And that's exactly what the offensive coordinator of the Arizona Cardinals said. He's our workhorse back. We're going to continue to give him the ball. And with that continuing to be the case and him finding the end zone as frequently as he has as of late over the course of the last 6 contests, I'm expecting James Conner to once again be a fantastic play this week, taking on the Los Angeles Rams defense. Our number 16 is James Cook. James Cook, 19 rushing attempts, 3 receptions, 22 total touches, continues his streak of success in terms of overall opportunities with the offensive coordinator. That's 6 out of the last 7 games of 19 or more touches. But like I warned you guys last week, James Cook is always going to be at risk for Josh Allen coming in and taking rushing touchdowns. Josh Allen in week 1, 2 rushing touchdowns. What a surprise. James Cook, even though he was able to surpass 10 fantasy points, would have loved to have seen him score a touchdown against the Arizona Cardinals. Now he takes on the Miami Dolphins. Last season against the Miami Dolphins, struggled mightily within the overall rushing game. 12 carries for 29, 13 carries for 36 on a short week. Could have a difficult matchup on hand based on the Miami Dolphins run-stopping defense. But ultimately, James Cook is still a talented back and given far too much opportunity to ignore for fantasy purposes. Now, speaking of this game, and of course, Josh Allen stealing touchdowns from James Cook every single week. Speaking of Josh Allen, for those of you guys who want to go ahead and sign up via Underdog Fantasy, you could take advantage of the free pick for Thursday night's game in regards to Josh Allen. Again, if you guys want my rankings for the remainder of the season, sign up using code Andrew, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, and take advantage of the free pick for this upcoming Thursday in terms of the pick and plays. Thank you. Number 17, we have Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. I know that Tank Bigsby got himself a lot of utilization, but that was in a positive game script. Until the final 4 seconds of that game, the Jacksonville Jaguars were either winning the game or tied at some point. So considering that overall factor, now taking on the Cleveland Browns, it will not be as easy of a matchup in which they're able to assume a lead early and maintain it for the remainder of the game. I'm anticipating to see far more utilization in terms of opportunities in the direction of Etienne, whether it's on the ground or through the air, and of course seeing far less utilization out of Tank Bigsby. I know that the head coach Doug Peterson said this offseason that he wants to get more utilization out of Tank Bigsby, but it's very much so going to be game script dependent on whether or not he gets that utilization. Now, last season, Travis Etienne did take on the Cleveland Browns in week 14. 14 carries for 35 and a touchdown, 4 receptions for 37 receiving yards, 15 plus fantasy points and a half PPR, hoping for the same this week. Number 18, we have Rachaad White. Very similar to Travis Etienne, he's having to fend off the potential of Bucky Irving taking on, some of that overall workload. So both of these offenses giving their second string running backs a lot of touches late in games when they're ahead, but do not be concerned. Rachaad White takes on the Detroit Lions. Now, when we talk about how good the run-stopping defense is for the Detroit Lions, over the course of their last 22 games, only once have they allowed over 70 rushing yards to an opposing team's RB1, that being Christian McCaffrey. That's it. The other 21 games, not a single other RB1 surpassed 70 rushing yards. Just to put that into perspective. Luckily for Rachaad White, he doesn't really find himself too much work in the rushing game. I mean, even in the last game that he took on the Detroit Lions in the 2023 playoffs, 9 carries for 55 rushing yards, but got his work done through the air. 4 receptions, 36 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 17 fantasy points. Most recently, against the Washington Commanders, 6 receptions for 75 receiving yards. That is where his value is pretty much based at. And in a negative game script, we'll see himself a lot more opportunity within the receiving game. Number 19, we have Rhamondre Stevenson, who had himself a surprisingly incredible week. I expected all week that the Cincinnati Bengals would be able to handle the New England Patriots offense. They were not capable of doing so. And what if the Seattle Seahawks aren't able to do so either? Can Rhamondre Stevenson come out and get himself another game in which he gets over 25 potential touches, 25 on the ground, 3 through the air? If that continues to happen, he was highly efficient. He had a lot of bursts, and this offensive line looked far better than they have in seasons past. But if the Seattle Seahawks do end up stopping this offense and the Seahawks maintain a commanding lead in terms of the score, it will lead to, of course, the New England Patriots having to throw the ball for the second half. And luckily for Rhamondre Stevenson, he is certainly a capable receiving back that has upside within that category. So regardless of whichever way this matchup goes, Rhamondre Stevenson certainly has value in week 2. Number 20, we have J.K. Dobbins, who now is kind of the clear running back one for this team. Gus Edwards is going to continue to get overall touches within this backfield, especially within this overall matchup. The Carolina Panthers are allowing the most fantasy points per game thus far this season in terms of rushing statistics isolated, and their best defensive lineman, Derrick Brown, is out for the remainder of the season. Therefore, we're anticipating J.K. Dobbins and the Los Angeles Chargers, a run-first attack, to run all over this defense. When J.K. Dobbins is rushing for 10 carries for 135 and a touchdown, also running more routes than Gus Edwards and getting himself more snaps, more carries. All the momentum is going to continue. He's going to get more touches, and he's going to clearly be the hot hand at the beginning of this game, taking on the Carolina Panthers. Number 21, we have Bijan Robinson Jr., who had a far better week than I anticipated. I really didn't ever expect him to get himself 3 receptions for 49 receiving yards, but he did. 12 rushing attempts, again, is a great number in my opinion, mainly because it was a negative game script for a majority of that contest, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and they are a pretty solid run-stopping defense. Despite this being said, he did score a rushing touchdown. Could have had even more rushing touchdowns if it wasn't for Jaden Daniels stealing, of course, 2 rushing touchdowns on the goal line. Jaden Daniels is going to continue to be a threat in that capacity for the remainder of the season, so it will hurt Bijan Robinson at times. But for this week, taking on the New York Giants, the Giants, again, a terrible run-stopping defense, allowed 4.7 yards per carry to the Minnesota Vikings running backs, 108 total yards, and a rushing touchdown. Last season against the New York Giants, Bijan Robinson Jr., again, 8.3 fantasy points in a game in which he only had 8 rushing attempts. And in week 11, 16.7 fantasy points, 17 carries for 73 rushing yards, and had himself a lot of utilization within the receiving game. So going into this matchup, I'm expecting immediate success for Bijan Robinson Jr. Number 22. We have Jerome Ford, who, even though he is a part of an offense that looks lackluster and looks like they are in a lot of trouble with Deshaun Watson, still was able to find himself a successful fantasy week because he is the preferred receiving back. And of course, as of right now, based on overall touches in terms of rushing attempts, the cleared away number 1 running back, playing 75% of the snaps within this offense. 12 rushing attempts, 44 rushing yards, saved his week with a rushing touchdown, but 6 receptions for 25 receiving yards on 7 targets is a beautiful number. Last season took on the Jacksonville Jaguars in week 14. In that game, 10.7 fantasy points, 5 receptions for 31 receiving yards. Again, that is a common factor for Jerome Ford. He is going to be implemented within the receiving game, and that is what unlocks his overall potential of being an RB2. Number 23, we have Najee Harris. Najee Harris, considering he was, of course, playing a vast majority of the overall running back snaps, had 20 rushing attempts, got himself a lot of utilization. And based on what we saw out of Jaylen Warren, obviously Jaylen Warren is still battling back from his hamstring injury. Jaylen Warren played less snaps than he ever played all of last season in week 1 of this year. So in terms of total snaps, in terms of overall percentages, didn't really play much. And if that's going to continue to be the case with even more workload opportunities for Cordero Patterson, this is going to be a Najee Harris-led offense. And considering how much they want to run the ball, with them already claiming that Justin Fields will be the starter in week 2, I believe that this is going to be immediate success for Najee Harris this week as a top 24 running back, taking on the Denver Broncos defense, who could not stop the run in week 1 against Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. Last season, they were also in the bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics. They are once again in that category this season. 24, we have Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones coming off a great game, but they're not taking on the New York Giants this week. They're taking on the San Francisco 49ers. And though we have been proven, based on the overall workload last night from Breece Hall, that it's not impossible for a running back of Aaron Jones' overall capabilities to find success against this defense. I mean, again, he went for over 100 overall yards against the San Francisco 49ers as a member of the Green Bay Packers in that playoff game. So Aaron Jones is certainly, equipped with the ability to have himself a solid game here. As to whether or not he accomplishes it is purely going to be dependent on what kind of Sam Darnold we find within this overall contest. Outside of that, it is a difficult matchup, but Aaron Jones is going to be given the vast majority of touches, which will lead to his fantasy success. Number 25, we have Josh Jacobs. Here's the issue that I have with Josh Jacobs. Even though you may look at the Indianapolis Colts matchup and think to yourself, man, Joe Mixon tore apart that defense. Andrew, you mentioned it earlier on in this episode. Joe Mixon had 4 or more yards on 19 of his 30 carries. He had a monster game. But it was primarily because the Indianapolis Colts defense could not stack the box. They had to cover Nico Collins, Dalton Schultz, Stephon Diggs, and Tank Dell. Going up against Malik Willis, you don't have to, protect from the wide receivers. Stack the box and force Malik Willis to beat you with his arm, which will make it difficult for Josh Jacobs. Even though he looked great in week 1 with 100 total plus yards and playing 73% of the offensive snaps, unfortunately, without a great quarterback under center, it's going to make it that much more difficult to run the ball as defenses will be stacking the box against the Green Bay Packers. Number 26, we have Tony Pollard, who had himself an incredible week 1. 16 carries for 82 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. 3 receptions on 4 targets. 16.9 fantasy points and a half PPR. And this is what I expected to see based on the overall workload that we saw during the preseason. I mean, again, Tony Pollard, 20 total opportunities, while Tyjae Spears had himself 8 total opportunities. Instead of it being a 1A, 1B, it's a 1 and 2 running back. Again, going into this week, I'm anticipating for Tony Pollard to continue to be the clear number 1 against the New York Jets run-stopping defense, who, of course, could not stop a soul against the San Francisco 49ers. Of course, they will be improved this week, obviously, because, this offensive line for the Tennessee Titans and the scheme as a whole isn't to the level of what the 49ers present. But what we did hear from the head coach, Brian Callahan, who is the primary play caller, is that he did say that he wants to get Tyjae Spears more workload going forward in terms of usage, which will diminish the overall upside of Tony Pollard. But hopefully, it's just coach speak rather than actual execution. And for all of us who have Tony Pollard, hopefully it'll continue that he's going to get the vast majority of overall touches. Number 27, we have Zack Moss. He's clearing away the number 1 running back of this team. 33 snaps in comparison to Chase Brown's 17. 13 opportunities in comparison to Chase Brown's 6. So if in fact he's going to continue to be the clear number 1, got himself the rushing touchdown out of this backfield, he's going to be of value in terms of a high-end RB3 or potentially even a low-end RB2 if in fact they're going to give him more opportunity. Again, 13 opportunities leading to 11 touches isn't the greatest, but if in fact the Cincinnati Bengals come out and they're not able to start out hot and this is going to be a negative game script, it may lead to Zack Moss getting far less potential touches than we would like. We're going to hope that the Cincinnati Bengals will get back Jamar Chase at 100% capacity. T. Higgins will also return and Joe Burrow can wake up this week. Number 28, we have DeAndre Swift. 1 target is not enough. On top of the fact that Caleb Williams, 14 of 29 passing? Just check the ball down to DeAndre Swift. Get him more opportunities to get the ball out of his hands quickly and get it to his running back who can make plays after the catch. Outside of that, 10 rushing attempts, not the greatest overall number, especially considering that we're losing for majority of this contest. It doesn't surprise me, but as it currently stands, I'm thinking, DeAndre Swift playing 70% of the offensive snaps, getting the vast majority of touches is a positive thing. He just needs to get himself more opportunities within the receiving game to be fantasy relevant while Caleb Williams struggles at the beginning of his career. Number 29, we have Devin Singletary. It's an advantageous matchup taking on the Washington Commanders defense. Again, they can't stop a soul, whether it's on the ground or through the air. So my anticipation is that Devin Singletary, who last week had himself 15 opportunities in 14 total touches, will get a similar workload of opportunity and has a higher potential upside of scoring a touchdown, considering both these defenses may not be able to stop a soul, and it could end up being a high-scoring game, hopefully within this division. Number 30, we have Ezekiel Elliott. He is clearing away the goal line back of this team. And considering how well the Dallas Cowboys played, even though they're not going to have Ferguson going forward, they are still going to be an effective offense considering Dak Prescott is leading them to the promised land with all the weapons he has within the receiving game. So as long as Ezekiel Elliott is going to lead this team in terms of rushing attempts, get himself, a sprinkle of receiving utilization, but also have an opportunity of scoring the goal line touchdowns, which again, there will be an abundance of, he is going to be of value as a middle range RB3. Now, speaking of the Dallas Cowboys, for those of you guys who want to take advantage of the free pick of CeeDee Lamb, for all customers, this is available via Underdog Fantasy, so be sure to take advantage of it going into this upcoming weekend's matchup. 0.5 total yards for CeeDee Lamb. This is an offer available, again, to all customers. Take advantage of that. Go down to the description below and check out the link to Underdog Fantasy. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, number 31, we have Austin Ekeler, who, again, even though he didn't get himself a lot of utilization within the rushing game, 2 rushing attempts for 10 yards, again, efficient in those opportunities, 4 receptions for 52 receiving yards is where he's going to find value. And as of right now, it is apparent, based on Jaden Daniels targeting his running backs, that his running backs are his favorite targets. He wants to get the ball out of his hands quickly. We remember last season, Sam Howell was the most hit quarterback amongst all because the offensive line could not protect, and Jaden Daniels getting the ball out of his hands is extremely smart early within his career. So now that the Washington Commanders take on the New York Giants this week, should be a positive game script, should lead to more rushing attempts, and of course, a similar utilization in terms of receiving work out of Austin Ekeler, who with more opportunity, especially within the rushing game, could see even more success for fantasy purposes. We have number 32, Chuba Hubbard. Again, it's going to be very much so dependent on whether or not this Carolina Panthers offense and defense improves. Obviously, they were pulled apart at the seams, against the New Orleans Saints, but I think they're going to improve and they're going to make strides, in terms of, hey, this is what we need to get better at, and we're going to immediately address that at practice and be able to demonstrate that against the Los Angeles Chargers. That being said, Chuba Hubbard is still clearly the number one in terms of overall snaps, even though he looked terrible. 1.4 fantasy points, 6 attempts for 14 yards. It was a byproduct of the fact that this team, were down very early within the game because, of course, they turned over the ball very quickly, and the New Orleans Saints were up 30-0 very quickly. So going into this week's matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers, I'm expecting a little bit more success from Chuba Hubbard to a capacity to where he'll be a top 36 running back. Gus Edwards is our number 33. Speaking of the matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers for Chuba Hubbard, Gus Edwards takes on the Carolina Panthers. It is the best matchup of the week. Their best defensive lineman is out for the season, and the Chargers are a run-first attack. And like the offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Chargers, Greg Roman, said, they want to give the ball to the running back with the hot hand. If, in fact, that hot hand ends up being Gus Edwards this week, do not be surprised, considering this rushing attack will have balance between Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins as we approach. Number 34 is Raheem Mostert. Under the assumption he is healthy and he plays on Thursday, it's going to be dependent on how much he really does play. Because if Jeff Wilson is going to be active and he's going to play just as much as he did this last week and get himself far more touches, it's going to impede on the upside of Raheem Mostert, especially in a negative game script in which they prefer to utilize Achane out of this backfield as a receiving threat. So if that's going to be the case, Raheem Mostert not as solidified of a play going into this upcoming week. Number 36, we have Javonte Williams, who again did not look great, but the offense as a whole was just a passing funnel. All they did was throw the ball with 42 passing attempts in Bo Nix's first career game. Now, going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, this Steelers pass rush is going to make Bo Nix's life a living hell if, in fact, he does not check it down to his running backs. Expect to see a lot of Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin receiving work. And speaking of Jaleel McLaughlin, he'll close out our top 36 because, like I said, with Bo Nix getting rushed down by TJ Watt, he's going to have to get the ball out of his hands relatively quickly before he gets hit. And looking in the direction of his running backs will be highly valuable. Jaleel McLaughlin coming off of a week in which he had 15 total touches. Last season in 2023, there were 4 games in which he had 12 or more touches. In those games, averaging over 12 fantasy points per game on average. The expectation is that Jaleel McLaughlin and Javonte Williams should be a little bit better in terms of their overall fantasy point contributions this week. Number 37, we have Tyjae Spears. Like I mentioned earlier with Tony Pollard, the current head coach, Brian Callahan of the Tennessee Titans, their primary play caller, did mention in the post-game press conference that he wants to get more usage out of Tyjae Spears. Last game, only 8 opportunities in comparison to Tony Pollard's 20. So if, in fact, we get more opportunities in the direction of Tyjae Spears, perhaps 12 total opportunities against the New York Jets, we're anticipating a lot of receiving work and potential rushing upside in this capacity, considering how well they ran the ball as an offense. Tyjae Spears always implicated to potentially steal a touchdown within the red zone. Number 38 and number 39 are both of the running backs of the Las Vegas Raiders. As it currently stands, I still have Zamir White ahead of Alexander Mattison. If you play in a full PPR, I'd probably have Alexander Mattison ranked higher, primarily because they do take on the Baltimore Ravens. They are plus 9.5 point underdogs. That is the biggest underdog of the season thus far. And because of that, we are in a situation in which Zamir White may not be given a lot of opportunity to run the ball because they'll be down 20 points within the first quarter or the first half of the game. So they may look to give Alexander a lot of overall receiving work in the second half of that game, which will, of course, siphon the workload out of Zamir White. But if he's able to get a lucky touchdown or a big run, don't be surprised. Number 40, the final running back I wanted to mention is Zach Charbonnet. Like I mentioned earlier in regards to Kenneth Walker, if Kenneth Walker is not healthy and does not play this week, Zach Charbonnet is most likely going to be a top 24 running back within my rankings going up against the New England Patriots. Last season, played a couple games as a starting running back and was effective in terms of his fantasy point contributions. Taking on the New England Patriots, again, even though that defense played well, I do anticipate that the Seattle Seahawks will be able to take advantage of it. And even if, in fact, Kenneth Walker does play, could be limited to a capacity in which Zach Charbonnet is given more opportunity. Zach Charbonnet, even when Kenneth Walker was healthy last week, scored himself a touchdown within the receiving game. All right, that's going to cover it for my week 2 top 40 running back rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. Again, like I mentioned before, subscribe if you haven't yet already. Click the like button down below. Let me know in the comment section what overall running backs are you firing up this week. If you have any questions, I'll try to get to them to the best of my ability. But for those of you guys who want all of your questions answered for the remainder of the season, you can check out the Patreon link down in the description. Thank you very much for all the support. Or, of course, check out Underdog Fantasy, where you can get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. All right, I'll be back tomorrow with my top 40 wide receiver rankings. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.